So imagine you're out on a boat, right? Just out in the open water. And usually if the water starts getting, a little rough, what do?
You drop an anchor.
Exactly. You drop an anchor, it catches the seabed, and suddenly you have some stability. Like you might drift a little bit with the waves, but you aren't going to get swept completely out to sea.
Right, because you have this fixed physical point that's just holding you in place against the
Yeah,
elements.
but think about this. What happens if you pull up that heavy iron anchor, toss it away entirely, and replace it with a virtual anchor on a screen?
Uh, well, I guess you'd be in trouble.
Right. I mean, it looks like an anchor. It has the little, icon of an anchor. But when a massive storm actually hits, you look around and realize you are entirely unmoored.
Wow, that is a very vivid image. And honestly, when you start applying that exact concept to human psychology, it becomes a really terrifying realization.
It really does. And welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are taking you through a super fascinating and, frankly, heavily debated conversation today.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is. We're looking at an interview from the Chris Williamson YouTube channel, and he's talking with the author Freya India. She basically spent the last 5 or 6 years writing a book exploring what she calls the extreme crisis of young women.
And her core argument is really specific too.
It is. She argues that modern young women, specifically in the Anglosphere, so places like the UK and the US, are experiencing this highly unique, localized crisis. And it's happening precisely because those traditional real-world anchors have been completely eroded.
Right. And, just to frame this for you as we get started, the ideas that Freya India brings up touch on some intensely charged topics.
Oh,
We're
absolutely.
talking about massive political shifts to the left and right,
Right.
really intense gender dynamics, and pretty huge controversies surrounding the modern therapy industry. So we just want to be clear. We aren't here today to endorse her conclusions
No.
or to condemn them either.
Exactly. We are just the messengers here.
Right. Our goal is strictly to map out the architecture of her argument. We just want to break down the mechanics of what she's saying so you can understand this massive cultural conversation that's raging around her book right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the central thesis India presents is that as foundational anchors like tight-knit neighborhood communities or shared religious upbringings or even just unstructured physical play, as those have vanished, social media hasn't just been a fun distraction.
No, not at all.
It has actively rushed in to fill that void with digital simulations of connection.
Yes, and that mechanism is just crucial to understand here.
Yeah.
Because without those traditional structures giving young people a sense of inherent unchanging value, the algorithm naturally becomes the ultimate authority.
Great.
And India argues that young women in particular are increasingly being conditioned to optimize themselves for the market. They are effectively being taught to view themselves as products rather than human beings who are just, collecting messy human experiences.
It's basically a complete psychological shift.
Exactly. You go from simply existing as a person to constantly managing a brand.
I do want to push back on that a little bit, though, because, I mean, teenagers have always wanted to fit in, right?
Yeah.
If you grew up in the 90s, you wanted the right sneakers or the right jeans to manage your quote-unquote brand in the high school hallway. So how is this fundamentally different from what previous generations went through?
It's a totally fair question.
Yeah.
But India argues the difference lies in the scale, the permanence, and the metrics.
Okay, how so?
Well, in the 90s, you went home at 3 o'clock, and the social performance ended, right? You were just at home. Today, it is a 24/7 global marketplace. I mean, the source material points out that we are talking about liberal teen girls spending upwards of 5 hours a day on social media.
5 hours a day? That's practically a full-time job.
It is, and it starts so early. Nearly a quarter of 5 to 7-year-olds in the UK have a smartphone.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
5 years old?
Yes. And this brand management starts before you can even speak. Parents are literally registering Instagram handles for their children before they are even born. You were essentially born into a marketing strategy.
Oh, wow. Okay, when you put it like that, the scale is completely different. Because if from the age of 10, every single experience you have is documented and marketed and performed in anticipation of an audience,
You never get a break.
right, you never really develop the ability to just have a private, quiet satisfaction. Your value is entirely determined by an external like count.
Exactly. And if you view yourself as this pristine startup company that needs to constantly increase in value, you naturally start making very different life choices. India points out that under this specific framework, Motherhood starts to be viewed as an unacceptable risk.
Wait, I have a hard time wrapping my head around that, to be honest. I mean, if you are treating yourself like a pristine startup company, does that mean motherhood is viewed as essentially exiting the business?
That is exactly how she frames it.
But isn't the whole modern girl bosses feminism thing about women having the power to have it all? How is motherhood a risk?
Well, because motherhood is the ultimate loss of control. Think about it. If your goal is to be this perfectly optimized, unblemished product, a baby physically alters your body.
True.
The experience is entirely unpredictable. And crucially, it is not something you can easily optimize for quick validation online. It effectively takes you out of the hyper-visible independent digital market.
That actually brings to mind the Emma Watson quote that Williamson brought up in the interview. She talked about I think her words were the violence and cruelty of the pressure to settle down and have a family. But India pushes back on that completely, right?
She does, yeah. India argues that Emma Lawson's perspective is basically outdated now. The overwhelming pressure for young women today isn't to settle down at all.
So what is the pressure then?
The cultural pressure is actually to stay single and unattached and perfectly self-actualized before you ever commit to anyone. It's this pervasive idea that you must be 100% perfectly healed and optimized before you're even worthy of a partner.
Which leads right into the terror of real-world messiness. Because if you feel like you have to be perfectly healed to interact with someone, you are naturally going to be terrified of actual flawed human beings.
Oh, absolutely.
And nowhere is that more obvious than in the paradox of modern dating and sex. Because we are looking at a Generation Z that is surrounded by the most hypersexualized messaging in human history, yet the data shows they're having significantly less sex than previous generations.
What's fascinating here is how the messaging from two completely opposite ends of the internet overlap to create that exact paralysis.
Yeah, explain that, because it sounds counterintuitive.
Well, you have the femosphere, which refers to these female-centric, often feminist influencer spaces, and then you have the manosphere, which is the male-centric, hypermasculine spaces.
Right, and they absolutely hate each other.
They despise each other.
Mm-hmm.
But the core message they are feeding young people is exactly the same.
Okay.
The opposite sex is dangerous, and being vulnerable with them will only lead to your destruction.
Wow. So they're essentially building the exact same wall, just from opposite sides.
Exactly.
I mean, you look at the media they consume. You've got magazines like Teen Vogue out there pushing hookup culture, publishing articles teaching teenagers about anal sex.
Yeah.
But then you have the most popular podcasts in the world for young women, like Call Her Daddy, framing sex and relationships as this terrifying, highly transactional battlefield.
There's actually a specific episode mentioned in the interview featuring a guest known as Mill Hunter. And the message being broadcast to millions of young female listeners is, quite literally, that men simply do not care about them.
That's so bleak.
It is. It's all framed as this zero-sum game where you have to protect your assets and never, ever show weakness.
And we can't ignore the sheer trauma of the environment they're navigating either. The conversation highlights how accidental exposure to hardcore porn on Twitter or Instagram is happening to kids as young as 6 or 8 years old.
It's just devastating.
Think about the mechanics of that. Like, before a girl has even held hands with a crush, her expectations of what intimacy looks like are being shaped by extreme, aggressive, often predatory dynamics on a screen.
Which naturally creates a profound physical alienation.
Mm-hmm.
And that alienation extends to how they view their own bodies, too. India brings up this really disturbing concept of face-tuned dysmorphia.
Yes. Let's talk about that, because the mechanism behind it is so insidious. We're talking about girls spending their most formative developmental years on apps where they can digitally slim their jaws, enlarge their eyes, tan their skin.
They're becoming completely different people.
Right. They spend hours a day reshaping their virtual avatar to look like a mathematically perfect person.
And the psychological damage really happens when they hit the undo button. When the screen reverts back to their natural human face, the contrast is horrifying to them. They basically become disgusted by their own physical reality.
Which makes me wonder, is the modern self-love movement essentially a Trojan horse?
What do you mean by that?
Well, because you have these massive influencers preaching self-love and body positivity, but then those exact same influencers are literally posting tutorials on how to digitally alter your jawline using a ring light and a filter. It feels like they are selling you the disease and the cure at the exact same time.
That is a perfect way to describe it. And think about the result. If your real-world interactions are too risky, and you are terrified of vulnerability, and you hate your unfiltered face, what do?
You retreat inward. You isolate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But humans still experience emotional distress. So what happens to normal teenage angst when you're constantly looking at yourself through a front-facing camera? It gets commodified.
Before we get into the commodification part, I really want to pause on the actual distress because the data here is incredibly heavy.
It really is.
The interview brings up the statistic that nearly 30% of American teen girls between 14 and 18 seriously considered suicide in 2021.
Yeah.
That is just a staggering, deeply upsetting number. We have to acknowledge that this isn't just some philosophical debate. There is a five-alarm fire happening right now with an entire generation's mental health.
It is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
The psychological distress is absolutely genuine. It is born from growing up in an environment that is deeply hostile to natural, messy human connection.
Right.
But India's argument is that the modern mental health industry, combined with social media algorithms, has essentially pathologized normal human reactions to that terrible environment.
So feeling sad about a disconnected world becomes a sickness.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
no longer just feeling understandably sad or anxious. Suddenly, that sadness is a disorder. It needs a clinical label, it needs a product, and most importantly, it needs an audience.
The evolution of how we share things online explains so much of this. Like 10 years ago, the game was posting the perfect highlight reel. You know, your vacation, your perfect latte.
Yeah, the perfectly curated life.
But then the algorithm shifted. The tech companies realized that vulnerability and trauma actually keep people on the app longer. There is this example brought up of Zoella, who is a massive beauty influencer in the UK. She transitioned from posting makeup tutorials to posting about her panic attacks.
And the incentives immediately changed. Revealing your trauma became highly rewarded. The platforms explicitly encourage this, constantly prompting users to share your story.
But it wasn't about actual support, was it?
No, the mechanics of the app meant it wasn't about communal healing at all. It was about generating deeply personal, highly engaging data that could be monetized. You literally get more clicks, more engagement, and more brand deals by performing your distress.
And right on cue, you have companies stepping in to monetize that vulnerability directly. The BetterHelp advertisements are a wild example of this.
Oh, the ads are unbelievable.
The interview points out how these online therapy ads literally script scenarios where normal, everyday parental advice, like a dad just saying, hey, you seem down, go for a walk in the sun, is framed by the ad as unhelpful, dismissive, or even toxic.
Right, they pathologize the parents.
Yes. They are actively trying to sever the reliance on friends and family, encouraging young people to bypass their community completely and rely exclusively on paid professionals on a screen.
Which raises an incredibly important question. What is all this professionalized clinical language actually doing to our everyday relationships?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. India highlights this mind-blowing 15-year graph of relationship advice on Reddit.
The Reddit data is so revealing.
It's crazy. Researchers analyzed over 1 million comments over a decade and a half, and they found that advice telling people to simply compromise dropped by half.
Wow.
Meanwhile, advice telling people to end the relationship or cut contact surged from 30% to over 50%.
And we really have to look at the mechanism of why that happens. Think about how the Reddit upvote algorithm works. It gamifies consensus and drama.
Oh, totally.
If you post about a fight with your partner and someone replies, well, human beings are flawed, you should probably sit down and compromise. That is boring advice. It doesn't get upvoted.
Nobody clicks on compromise.
Right. But if someone replies using aggressive therapy speak, saying, he violated your boundaries, he has a toxic attachment style, cut all contact immediately, that sounds powerful. It sounds absolute, and the algorithm pushes it right to the top.
So are we arming people with therapy speak just to make them more isolated? Because it sounds like it gives people an articulate, socially acceptable excuse to completely avoid the messy, required work of actually dealing with another flawed human being.
Precisely. Therapy language terms like boundaries, narcissist, or gaslighting is often weaponized in these online spaces to obscure the real problem, which is an intense aversion to normal social friction.
Which creates a massive pressure cooker. You have this combination of inward rumination, intense fear of vulnerability, and an internet addiction that rewards absolute moral purity.
Yeah, it's a toxic mix.
And according to India, this eventually spills out of the personal realm and explodes directly into the political sphere.
And this is where the data reveals a massive blind spot in our current cultural narrative. Because for years, the media focus has overwhelmingly been on young men being radicalized to the political right by figures in the manosphere.
Right, that's all we hear about.
But a major piece by the New Statesman, which they discuss in the interview, found something else entirely. Young men, statistically, have largely stayed where they were politically over the last 20 years. It is young women who have lurched dramatically to the radical left.
Which is fascinating. And India presents this theory that just like social media naturally plays on young men's vices like aggression or dominance, progressive online politics caters perfectly to young women's vices.
Right.
Specifically, indirect aggression, cancel culture, and something called safetyism.
Let's define safetyism really quickly because it's a critical concept here. It's the belief that people are fundamentally fragile and must be protected not just from physical harm, but from any emotional discomfort or opposing viewpoints.
So it basically equates feeling offended with being in literal physical danger.
Exactly.
And we really saw this cultural shift crystallize in 2020. The conversation points to the phenomenon of posting black squares on Instagram during the protests.
Oh, the black squares.
Right. Suddenly, your morality wasn't about what you actually did in your physical community. It was instantly measurable by a digital square, and it was fiercely, ruthlessly policed by teenage girls online. Cara Delevingne posting the tagline, "Silence is consent," perfectly captured this. If you didn't post the exact right image at the exact right time, your reputation was destroyed.
Because the algorithm rewards absolute compliance and punishes nuance. And this hyper-policing online creates some incredibly strange real-world contradictions, particularly when it comes to empathy. India calls this the empathy trap.
I want to make sure I understand this trap, actually. Because isn't empathy for a war zone a good thing? Why does she see that as a problem?
Empathy is a good thing, of course. But the trap is when it becomes purely performative at the expense of the people right in front of you.
Okay, that makes sense.
There's an example given of a holistic therapist posting about global conflicts in Sudan and Gaza, framing these massive geopolitical wars as the viscerality of the feminine wound. There is this profound, heavily vocalized empathy for vast, complex global conflicts happening thousands of miles away.
Oh, I see. And then you juxtapose that with the Labrador boyfriend anecdote they mentioned from the New Statesman piece.
Yeah, the Labrador boyfriend.
Where a young woman is literally complaining to a journalist that her privately educated boyfriend is like a golden retriever who has never faced adversity, and she proudly claims that she's the only adversity in his life. It's wild.
Completely backward.
You have massive, highly publicized empathy for a war zone and absolutely zero grace or empathy for the human being sitting across the kitchen table from you.
Exactly. It raises the question, is it genuine care? Or is it just another form of digital reputation management? Because the algorithm rewards the appearance of absolute moral purity on global issues, which naturally leads to a very judgmental, rigid worldview in your actual living room.
I keep thinking about how this behavior isn't isolated to teenage girls anymore either. Has social media essentially feminized everyone's behavior?
That is a very interesting point.
Because even grown, highly educated men on platforms like X are engaging in the exact same indirect aggression, gossip, and reputation destruction. Since you can't physically confront someone through a computer screen, everyone defaults to the worst, most manipulative traits of a high school cafeteria.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you really start to understand the sheer scale of the backlash Freya India has received for writing this book.
Oh, people are furious.
When you point out these contradictions, when you hold up a mirror to the mechanics of how people are behaving, you trigger an intensely defensive reaction.
And the pushback has been vicious. The interview talks about one-star Goodreads reviews pouring in from people who clearly only read the first chapter.
Yeah, they didn't even read the whole thing.
Not at all. They are calling her book a Handmaid's Tale manifesto. They compare her to the villain Serena Joy. They accuse her of pushing a fascist far-right agenda just for questioning these dynamics.
It's a highly revealing reaction, though, because, as Indy points out, her book is aggressively critical of corporate capitalism and tech billionaires who are commodifying children.
Which are usually left-wing talking points.
Historically, yes. But because she questions the ultimate motives of girl boss feminism, because she's critical of the glamorization of divorce, and because she challenges the mental health industry without offering the standard liberal disclaimers, she is perceived by critics as an existential threat to their worldview.
There's this great quote from Douglas Murray that Chris Williamson brings up, and it sums this dynamic up perfectly. Murray joked that being white and conservative makes him the straight of the gay community.
I remember that.
And the parallel drawn here to India is that even though she is a young woman writing specifically about the female experience, her female privilege is completely dismissed by her critics simply because her conclusions lean to the right.
Right?
If you don't blame the patriarchy and instead you blame a culture that tells women to prioritize their corporate careers over human connection, you are immediately coded as a dangerous reactionary.
It's immediate excommunication from that sphere.
So, what does this all mean? The conversation highlights this bizarre hypocrisy at the center of it all. You have anti capitalist progressives viciously defending billionaire owned social media tech companies while simultaneously attacking a young woman who wrote a book criticizing those very companies for harming children. It's a complete paradox.
It is a paradox, but it makes sense when you realize how powerful these digital anchors have become. People will defend the very platforms that are making them miserable because those platforms are now their primary source of social status, moral validation, and belonging. When you threaten the platform, you aren't just critiquing a company. You are threatening their entire digital existence.
It is a lot to process. But taking a step back, synthesizing everything we've talked about today, whether you agree with Freya India or whether you side with her harshest critics, the picture painted by this data is undeniable.
Completely undeniable.
We are watching a generation grapple with profound technological and cultural whiplash. It is the real-time collision of our ancient, hardwired human needs for messy, risky connection, crashing headfirst into highly optimized, profit-driven digital simulations.
And that collision leaves us with a deeply unsettling reality to ponder as we wrap up. Let's go back to that Reddit graph where advice to cut contact has surged to 50%.
Okay.
We know that artificial intelligence models like ChatGPT are actively trained on vast amounts of internet text, including millions of those exact Reddit relationship threads.
Right. It scrapes all that data to learn how humans talk to each other.
Exactly. So if we have an entire generation feeding its deepest social and romantic anxieties into a platform where the overwhelmingly dominant, algorithmically rewarded advice has shifted away from compromise and toward cut contact and end the relationship. Are we unknowingly training our future artificial intelligence to permanently codify human isolation and risk aversion?
Wow. If the AI learns that the logical solution to every bit of human friction is just to walk away, we are in for a very, very lonely future.
We really are.
It brings us right back to that anchor we talked about at the beginning. If we've traded our real-world anchors for digital ones, we need to be incredibly careful about who is writing the code for the virtual seabed. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information landscape around you, and we'll see you next time.